cheat sheet notes here. And Brenda Davis, registered dietitian, is a world-leading plant-based pioneer, also an internationally acclaimed speaker, which is very nice. Of course, Canada, So, and beyond. It's not just Canada. Brenda has been featured speaker at a medical, nutrition, and also dietetic conferences in 25 countries on 6 continents. So I'll let her tell a little bit more about herself, but let's welcome Brenda Davis.
Thank you. This is working. Let's see where I'll put this water. Well, first I'd like to say a great thank you to May and Jen and to all the organizers and volunteers. It really is a privilege to be here and to meet so many like-minded individuals and people that are just hoping to make some changes. And I hope that my presentation will give you a few, starting points and some new information as well. So I wonder if I stand here, is that okay? Good. So I'm going to be talking about unleashing the power of plant-based diets. Oh, I need a clicker. That would help. There we go. And I have no disclosures. I'll start with a very brief outline. We're going to talk a little bit about the strength of the link between diet and disease, and then the evidence that plant-based diets afford protection. And then we'll talk a little bit about why plant-based diets are so effective in this regard. And then I'd like to share just a little bit about my own personal experience putting lifestyle medicine into practice in the Marshall Islands and Lithuania. And then we will conclude the presentation with 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet for disease prevention and reversal or remission. And so that's what we're covering. It's a lot. I have a lot of slides. And I want to start out with a little story about my dad. And this story happened, it was definitely over 40 years ago. I was in university and I was at home for a reading break. I was in the kitchen preparing some healthy food. And my dad, as you can see, was not exactly a health nut. And he used to just love to tease me about my passion for health and nutrition. And here I am in the kitchen preparing my food, and he walks by me, sticks his belly out as far as he could, and it was far. And and he sauntered by me very slowly with a bag of chips and a bag of licorice, all sorts, in one hand, a huge bottle of Coke in the other, and 2 cigarettes hanging out of his mouth. And he does this cheeky grin, just to tease me. And of course, I gave him the look of disgust. But about an hour later, I went up to him and I said, I just don't understand why you're doing this to yourself. I said, we want you to be around for a long time. And you're not going to be if you keep living this way. And he said to me, I'd rather live 50 years having the freedom to do all the things that I love and eat all the things that I love than live 75 years having to restrict this and restrict that and not having any fun. And he said, I could get hit by a truck tomorrow. And I responded, I know, Dad, but it doesn't mean you have to walk out in front of one. You see, this is what we know. We know that 70% of all deaths globally are due to chronic diseases of our own making. An estimated 90% plus of type 2 diabetes, 80% plus of heart disease, and 30 to 70% of cancers are considered entirely preventable. And in 2011, the World Health Organization identified the 4 big lifestyle culprits, and they identified them as being smoking, drinking alcohol, being sedentary, and eating an unhealthy diet. And they defined an unhealthy diet as one that is based on processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products rich in saturated fats. It's low and high fiber plant foods such as vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. And what I want you to notice about this definition is they identify the two categories of foods that are most strongly linked with increased risk of disease, and those are processed foods and animal products. And they identify one category of food that is protective, and that is high fiber plant foods. And at the highest risk are inactive populations consuming Western style diets. The highest rates globally are North America, Northern Europe, Australia, and unfortunately all the developing countries that are adopting our Western ways. And at the lowest risk are populations who live simply, are physically active, and eat unprocessed plant-based diets. The lowest rates globally are in some parts of rural Asia, South America, and of course, the blue zones. And the blue zones are places where there are more centenarians than anywhere else on the planet. But what's really interesting about these long-lived peoples are that nearing the ends of their lives, when they're 95 or 100 years of age, they're actually still productive and relatively healthy. Look at this man. He's a centenarian. He's 100 years old. It's unbelievable. I love the stories about some of these people. If you ever pick up John Robbins' book or some of the Blue Zones books, it's really interesting. So there are 5 blue zones that have been identified. Loma Linda, California, that's the Seventh-day Adventists of Loma Linda, Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, and of course Okinawa, Japan. And what's really interesting about these places, of course there's some lifestyle practices that are sort of, unique to each blue zone. There are some that are shared by 2 or more blue zones, but there are 6 lifestyle practices that are common to every single blue zone we know of. And this Venn diagram looks at Loma Linda, Sardinia, and Okinawa, but these factors are applicable to every blue zone. They all have strong families. Family is important. They tend not to smoke. They're socially engaged. They do constant, moderate physical activity. And where diet is concerned, they all consume plant-based diets, and they all include legumes as dietary staples. And the evidence for plant-based diets just continues to build. The number of studies released every year is unbelievable. And I can tell you, among the sort of most impressive work to me are the studies that compare people who live similar healthy lifestyles, who sort of, drink the same amount, exercise the same amount, smoke the same amount, etc., but they have different dietary patterns. And so there are actually 3 cohorts or 3 populations where we've been following them for many years to see who dies of what. And the populations are number 1 in North America, the Adventist Health Study 2, over 96,000 participants, and this study began in 2002 and it's ongoing. The second is in UK, it's called EPIC Oxford, over 65,000 individuals, began in 1993 and is ongoing. And the third population are actually 2 cohorts from Taiwan. One is called the Suchi Vegetarian Study, over 12,000 participants, began in 2005, and the Suchi Health Study, which is over 6,000 participants, and it began in 2007. And what's really interesting about these populations is these health-conscious cohorts, regardless of their dietary pattern, whether they're omnivore, lacto-ovo, vegetarian, or vegan, they die at about half the rates of the general population in their regions. So when we're comparing vegans to omnivores in these cohorts, we're comparing vegans to omnivores who smoke the same amount, drink the same amount, exercise the same amount. We're actually controlling for all of these confounding variables, which is really important. So the numbers, the differences you see are not the differences you would see with the general population, which would be much, much greater. So let's consider some of the findings. For ischemic heart disease compared to similar health-conscious meat eaters, the rates were, for Epic Oxford, 13% lower among pesco-vegetarians. So this is lacto-ovo-vegetarians plus fish. Okay, so these are basically plant-based eaters who include fish and dairy and eggs. And they were the ischemic heart disease rates were 22% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans, again, compared to similar health-conscious omnivores. And then in the Adventist Health Study 2, they were 23% lower among pesco-vegetarian men, 24% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarian men, and 55% lower among vegan men. That's impressive. Now, what was a little bit confusing about this study was there weren't any significant differences in the women, but the pesco-vegetarian women tend to do the best of all of the dietary groups among women, and the researchers weren't sure why this was the case. Now, for hypertension in the Adventist Health Study 2, the lacto-ovo-vegetarians had a 55% lower risk, and the vegans had a 75% lower risk. For stroke, we had more mixed results. So there were unfavorable findings from Epic Oxford, and compared to health-conscious meat eaters, total stroke was actually 14% higher among pesco-vegetarians and 20% higher among vegans and vegetarians, lacto-ovo. And hemorrhagic stroke was 12% higher among pesco-vegetarians and 43% higher among the vegetarian and vegan population. So that was really quite shocking. The researchers suggested some possible reasons. This cohort tended to have low vitamin D intake, low vitamin B12, which means higher homocysteine levels, low levels of certain essential amino acids, and low levels of omega-3 fatty acids. And so they wondered if it could be something or all of the above that would explain this. But what's really interesting is we did not see this with the Adventist Health Study 2 in Suchi. In the Adventist Health Study 2, there was a systematic review of 8 studies, and it showed that vegetarians and vegans combined had a 29% lower risk of cerebrovascular diseases. And then in Suchi, compared to health-conscious meat eaters, in cohort 1, the larger vegetarian study, ischemic stroke was 59% lower among the vegetarians. And I should mention that in Taiwan, the people in this study, they were mainly Buddhists, and their diet is extremely low in dairy. Dairy isn't a big part of their diet. They have a small amount of eggs, so they were actually very near vegan, the people in this cohort. And hemorrhagic stroke was 66% lower among vegetarians. And in cohort 2, the Suchi Health Study, ischemic stroke was 74% lower among the vegetarians. So they did better. And then another study, this is the Harvard Nurses Health Study, Nurses Health Study 2, and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, over 200,000 participants. They actually looked at stroke risk and the PDI, which is called, the plant-based diet index. And if you eat a lot of plant foods, you have a higher PDI. If you eat a lot of animal foods, you have a low PDI. And they also looked at what they call the HPDI, or the healthy PDI, which is really where whole plant foods predominate in the diet, versus the unhealthy PDI, where unhealthy processed foods predominate in the plant-based diet. So compared to participants with the lowest PDI, the risk of stroke was 6% lower in those with the highest PDI, 10% lower in those with the highest HPDI, and 5% higher in those with the highest UPDI. So, overall, a vegetarian diet wasn't associated with total stroke, although lower total stroke was observed in those with healthy plant-based diets. And the take-home message here is diet quality matters, plant-based or otherwise. It's really important. And generally, Epic Oxford, some of the diets are a little less well put together in terms of B12 and vitamin D especially, and calcium, than the Adventist Health Study 2. for diabetes. Compared to similar health-conscious meat eaters, the risk in the Adventist Health Study 2 was 21% lower among pesco-vegetarians, 38% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 62% lower among vegans. And in Epic Oxford, it was 35% lower among lacto-ovo, 47% lower among vegans, and it was 53% lower among pesco-vegetarians. And then in Suchi, again, compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, the risk was 51% lower among vegetarian men and 75% lower among vegetarian women. And I just have to tell you, these pictures here, I was one of the keynote speakers for Suchi International Medical Association annual conference in 2008, and we had a tour of the kitchen. I have so many stories to tell about this trip. It was just an incredible trip. But they did a tour of the medical school and a tour of the kitchen. And the first thing I noticed when we walked into the kitchen was all these these bags were humongous. They were this high, and they were filled with greens. And I said, "Whoa, what's that?" And they said, "Well, that's the organic greens that the nuns picked from their organic gardens this morning. That's the main food for people in this hospital." And I went, wow, what a concept, Can you believe it? That is the main food. So a hospital that's really healing people, it's amazing. And then non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in Suchi was found to be 21% lower among vegetarians, and replacing soy with meat or fish actually increased risk 12 to 13%, and replacing whole grains with refined grains increased risk 3 to 12%. And then cancer, compared to health-conscious meat eaters in Epic Oxford, it was 11% lower among lacto-ovo, 12% lower among pesco-vegetarians, and 19% lower among vegans. And in Adventist Health Study 2, sort of similar numbers, 8% among lacto-ovo, 12% among pesco, and 16% lower among vegans. But what's really interesting is the Suchi study with breast cancer. Breast cancer was 58% lower among the vegetarians, and daily soy intake, soy with isoflavones, so sort of natural soy like tofu and tempeh and soy milk and edamame. Daily soy isoflavone intake was associated with a 63% lower risk of breast cancer. Cataracts in Epic Oxford were 21% lower among pesco, 30% lower among lacto-ovo, and 40% lower among vegans. You're seeing a pattern here, right? So cataracts in Suchi, 20% lower among vegetarians, 30% lower among overweight vegetarians than overweight non-vegetarians. And diverticular disease was 10% lower among pesco-vegetarians. It was 27% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and it was 72% lower among the vegans. That's in Epic Oxford. Urinary tract infections in Suchi were 16% lower, the association mainly for females. Gout in Suchi was 77% lower among vegetarians. That was the Suchi Health Study, and 39% lower among vegetarians in the Suchi Vegetarian Study. Depression in Suchi was 30% lower among the vegetarians. Kidney disease in the Adventist Health Study 2 was 52% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians and vegans in Epic Oxford compared to those with a high meat intake, and they defined a high meat intake as 3.5 ounces of meat per day, which isn't that high. But anyway, kidney stones were reduced by 27% in pesco-vegetarians and 31% in vegans and vegetarians. Now, this is the one sort of downside, definitely not the more favorable effects of diet that we see in all the other chronic diseases. But in Epic Oxford, risk of hip fractures was actually 25% higher among vegetarians and 231% higher among vegans, or 2.3 times higher. Vegans also had a 43% increased risk of total fractures, but the higher risk was only in vegans with a BMI below 22.5, and it was mainly for postmenopausal women. It was not noticed for men. And in the Adventist Health Study 2, and this is, almost 35,000 participants followed for about 8 years, vegan females had a 55% higher risk of hip fractures than non-vegetarians. Now, this is interesting. Those who were taking calcium and vitamin D supplementation, the risk disappeared. They didn't have any increased risk at all. And there was no association between diet and hip fractures in the men in this particular study. So why the increased risk of fractures? Well, probably the biggest reason is we have the lowest BMI of all dietary groups. So in the Adventist Health Study 2, the vegans were the only group that was within the healthy BMI range. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians and meat eaters were all in the overweight range. So that's one reason, so less bone mass, lower calcium intakes, lower vitamin D intakes, lower protein intakes, and lower or less hormone replacement therapy, especially in the Epic Oxford, they found this. So these are all possible reasons. Now, in 2020, there was a review of the evidence on osteoporosis, and there was no evidence that a plant-based diet, when carefully chosen to maintain adequate calcium and vitamin D levels, has any detrimental effects on bone health. I actually have a personal experience. After being vegan for about 20 years, and now I've been vegan for, 35 years, I had my bone density done because my physician was really concerned that I'd been vegan for 20 years, and my mom had osteoporosis, and I was a slim white female, so higher risk to start with. And he did got me to get a scan, and my T-scores were +2 to 2.5 standard deviations above the young adult mean. And my doctor brought me in, and he opened up my chart to tell me what my results are, and his jaw literally dropped. He said the arrow, they couldn't even plot it on the chart. It was off. They had an arrow off the top of the chart. And he said, I don't know what you're doing, but your bones are made of steel. He said, just keep doing it. And osteoporosis is 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean. So it was really shocking to him. He said, I've never seen anybody with bone density that high. And my mom had been diagnosed with osteoporosis at the same age as my bone density was done. And the point being, and this is me, I'm physically active. I'm 64 years old now, but I still can do, handstands and headstands and all of that sort of stuff, and run, and and I don't feel any different than I did when I was 30, to be honest with you. I can still do everything I did back then. And so it's just the point being that if you do, stay active and eat well, I always make sure that I have enough calcium and vitamin D in my diet, that I get enough protein, that I get all of the nutrients that are needed for bone health. And plant strong bones are really about meeting the RDAs for calcium, ensuring a source of vitamin D, being aware of other nutrients that impact bone health, and making sure you have sources, protein and magnesium, potassium and boron and copper and iron and zinc, and vitamin A and vitamin C and vitamin K and all of that. And eating at least 9 servings of vegetables and fruits a day is also a good idea. And then exercising, exercising, I would say, for at least an hour a day. And that's kind of what I do, or an hour and a half or something like that, depending on what I'm doing. And then another thing that's interesting is if you look at longevity, and this is from the Adventist Health Study 1, but I love this study because in this study, they found that vegetarian men lived 9.5 years longer than vegetarian women in California. But what's really interesting is they identified the 5 main contributors to longevity. And for people that had all 5, they lived an average of 10 years longer than people who didn't have these things. So never smoking, having a lower body weight, exercising more often, following a vegetarian diet, and eating nuts frequently. They said that was the one food that was identified as increasing longevity more than any of the other foods that were included. And we've already talked a little bit about COVID-19, But there are a number of studies that show an advantage to plant-based eaters. And the COVID symptom study showed a 41% lower risk in people that had high intakes of fruits and vegetables and other plant foods. And then we talked about this 6-country study that showed a 73% risk reduction of moderate to severe COVID for people eating plant-based. And if they ate plant-based or pescatarian, it was just 59%, but still pretty significant. And now we have some evidence saying that it may be long COVID as well. So not only do plant-based diets protect against many chronic diseases, but they also provide a safe and powerful treatment option, in some cases reversing disease. And what we see with heart disease is that plant-based diets improve heart disease risk factors, many heart disease risk factors. And really, they're the only diet that I'm aware of that has ever been shown to actually reverse heart disease. Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish, of course. And then diabetes, we see improvements in blood lipids and insulin sensitivity. And in motivated patients, we often see remission of type 2 diabetes. And cancer, plant-based diets favorably alter genetic expression, as Dean Ornish showed. They reduce cancer cell growth. They decrease DNA damage. So there's a lot of things happening there. So let's move on. I'll share just a little bit about putting lifestyle medicine into practice in the Marshall Islands and Lithuania. And of course, the Marshall Islands I could talk for hours about, and I just have a few minutes, but I just want to share a little bit. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Marshall Islands are kind of somewhere between Hawaii and Australia, directly north of New Zealand, about 5 to 7 degrees north of the equator. And as you can see, they're very remote. They're like 2,300 miles from Hawaii. So there's nothing anywhere close to them. That may be why they were used as atomic bomb testing grounds after the Second World War. But that's a whole other story. So the Marshall Islands have declared a state of emergency where diabetes is concerned. They have among the highest prevalence of diabetes and the highest death rates from diabetes on the planet. In 2021, the estimated prevalence was 25.1%. The estimates have ranged between 25 and 34% over the last 5 years. About half of all surgeries on the island are amputations due to diabetes. It's shocking. So was diabetes a problem in the past? Actually, no, not at all. But diabetes was pretty much unheard of in the Marshall Islands 100 years ago. People were slim, physically active, and they lived off the land. And what did they eat? Well, they ate whatever they could catch from the ocean, and it was usually spearfishing. And they ate whatever grew on the land, which was mainly coconut and paley leaves and breadfruit and and pandanus and those kinds of foods, and that was it. And they had to work really hard to get their food. They didn't come from a grocery store. Today, people are more sedentary and they eat highly processed diets. You can imagine on the main island, Majuro, they've got 30,000 people. That island might support 500 to 1,000 people. They have to import foods. They have to, and they're super poor. So, of course, they import the cheapest foods that you can imagine. And so people live on this sticky white rice and cheap meat, either processed meat. You can see turkey tails over in the right-hand corner, but essentially cheap meat. They like Spam a lot, so these processed meats. And they wash it all down with luau. And luau, number one ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. It would actually be really difficult to design a diet to induce diabetes any better than the diet these folks have adopted. And I'll never forget when I first arrived, I saw the kids eating ramen noodles dry out of the packages. And one day I saw, their favorite thing to put on top was Kool-Aid powder. So they would crack open a bag of ramen noodles, sprinkle on Kool-Aid powder. And one day I saw somebody sprinkling white stuff over the Kool-Aid powder. And I said to the Marshallese person that was next to me, "What in the heck is that?" And they said, "Oh, that's Ajinomoto. Ajinomoto is pure MSG." Top it off with MSG. So it really is, not a great thing. So I went in with a team, and we did a project where we did 3 months of lifestyle medicine we actually had 160 residents of Majuro with A1Cs of at least 8 or on diabetes medications. We used a randomized parallel design with 5 overlapping cohorts. And then we did intensive education, healthful eating, exercise, stress management, social connection, sleep. They didn't have a problem with social connection there. I'll tell you, we could learn a lot from them on that front. Addiction control, we taught them how to grow gardens, all of that in earth boxes or whatever we could get. And I just, you can't even believe the number of stories that are very touching. These are just amazing people. They just know how to have fun. They laugh all the time. And it's just, people that came to get screened to see if they could be in the program were in tears if they didn't get in, if they didn't have diabetes. They wanted to have diabetes so they could be in the program. And then I caught people in the control group at the grocery store buying healthy food because they didn't get into the intervention group and they wanted to do the program, so they were going to do it by themselves. They were part of the control group. That was a problem. But what we ended up doing was we told everybody in the control that we would let them into the program eventually. We would do programs just for them, so that they wouldn't cheat anymore. So anyway, our diet was basically a whole food plant-based diet. It was high fiber, moderate sodium. It was fairly low fat, about 20% of calories. It was very anti-inflammatory. And these are just, rushing through this, but within 2 weeks, we saw drops in blood glucose of 71 milligrams per deciliter on average. We started getting better at it. Even after the research was over, we'd go back and do interventions. I actually went back to create a health curriculum for the public schools and trained all the teachers on the island. So did a lot of things there, but we were getting so good at it, we were getting drops within 2 weeks of 100 milligrams per deciliter in blood glucose. And by 12 weeks, it wasn't quite as good, minus 48 milligrams per deciliter, because they were eating some of their own food then. So they were getting all of our food. Everything they ate at 2 weeks was from the clinic, and they incorporated some of their own by 12 weeks. A1Cs dropped by 1.9 points on average, and HSCRP, a measure of inflammation, was down 1.2 points as well. Oh, and I should say, you can see in the top, the red circle, that's me and Dr. John Kelly. So Dr. Kelly was the founding president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and he was my partner on this investigation. And there, Dr. Kelly and I are in Lithuania. We got invited by the medical school and the government to do a lifestyle medicine demonstration project. And we had 10 patients, and we did 10 days of intensive lifestyle medicine with them. Oh, and the people in the picture, the guy on the left is the dean of the lifestyle medicine program at the university there. And that program, he's entirely vegan. And then the other two, one is one of the medical school directors, and then the director of public health. So we were actually on a hike, you can see in the States. That's when I first met them. But anyway, within 10 days, we had drops in cholesterol of 25% plus. We had drops of triglyceride drops of up to 50% within 10 days. We saw massively improved fasting glucose numbers, reduced HSCRP, and a lot of reduction in joint pains as well. So why are plant-based diets so effective? Well, plant-based diets are effective because they put a lid on the drivers of chronic disease. They put a lid on things like inflammation, oxidative stress, lipotoxicity, and dysbiosis. And I'll just tell you a little bit about each of these. So systemic chronic inflammation increases the risk of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, kidney disease, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what causes this kind of inflammation? Well, excess body fat, especially visceral fat. And for those of you that aren't aware of the difference, visceral fat is the kind of fat that's in and around your vital organs. And it tends to release a lot of inflammatory cytokines. And the subcutaneous fat is the fat near the surface of your skin. So sometimes you see people with soft, big bellies, they have more subcutaneous fat. The big hard bellies, more of that fat is in and around their vital organs, and that's really problematic. And physical inactivity, poor diet, pollutants, and stress all contribute to systemic chronic inflammation. So there's a plant-based advantage. So we have a systematic review and meta-analysis of 21 studies. This is over 2,600 participants. And they found that vegan and vegetarian diets resulted in reductions in one of our main measures of inflammation, C-reactive protein. For vegans, it was minus 0.54 milligrams per liter. For vegetarians, minus 0.25. And for vegetarian and vegan patients with impaired kidney function, this is shocking, minus 3.91 milligrams per liter in those individuals. So really profound effects. Oxidative stress is really an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants in the body. And oxidative stress damages proteins, lipids, DNA, and cell membranes, promoting cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancer. And what causes oxidative stress? Well, we know about cigarette smoking and ionizing radiation and air pollution and UV light, but also, of course, diet. And where diet is concerned, it's heavy metals and other environmental contaminants, products of oxidation in cooking, which I'll tell you more about later. The Western diet, a diet that's high in animal fat and protein, low in fiber or high fiber plant foods, and is high in highly processed foods. And a diet that contains insufficient antioxidants, which come, of course, mainly from plant foods. And again, we see a plant-based advantage, and the studies just go on and on and on. I just listed a few of them, but studies consistently demonstrate that people eating plant-based have more favorable antioxidant status than omnivores, probably owing to their higher antioxidant intakes and lower pro-oxidant intakes. Lipotoxicity is really the accumulation of accumulation of fat in non-adipose tissue. So in places where fat's not really meant to be stored, for example, in your vital organs and in your muscle tissue. Now, certainly we need some fat in our muscle tissue for when we're, running or need energy quickly, but we end up with too much of the wrong kind of fat in muscle tissue. And this can cause cell damage or cell death, tissue inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, and elevated triglycerides. So lipotoxicity in your liver is a formula for insulin resistance. It triggers insulin resistance throughout your body. If you store lipids in your pancreas, it can destroy beta cells. So lipotoxicity is a huge problem. And it can increase blood glucose as well. So what causes lipotoxicity? Overconsumption leading to overweight and obesity. I think your body naturally will shuttle extra calories to adipose tissue, but sometimes it just can't do it fast enough, so it sends fat to different parts of your body. Diets that are high in fat, saturated fat, and/or trans fatty acids increase lipotoxicity, and diets high in refined carbohydrates, so white flour products and sugars. So again, there's a plant-based advantage. Those eating 100% plant-based diets have the lowest rates of overweight and obesity of all dietary patterns. They have lower levels of what we call intramyocellular lipids, which is fat inside muscle tissue, and it's a marker of lipotoxicity than matched omnivores, and they have the lowest intakes of saturated fat of all dietary patterns. And then dysbiosis. Well, dysbiosis is unhealthy gut flora, essentially. And dysbiosis can increase gut permeability and the production of inflammatory cytokines. Dysbiosis increases the risk of obesity and associated diseases, inflammatory and autoimmune conditions, insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, and neurodegenerative disorders like brain degenerative disorders. So what causes dysbiosis? Well, an unhealthy Western-style diet, refined carbohydrates, processed foods, high meat, high fat, low fiber, alcohol, chemical contaminants, antibiotics, medications, stress, and poor dental hygiene. So again, we see a plant-based advantage here, and a huge plant-based advantage where dysbiosis is concerned. Many studies have reported healthier gut microbiomes in plant-based consumers. Vegan diets have been shown to increase short-chain fatty acid production in friendly flora, decrease unfriendly flora, and these changes inhibit the growth of pathogens, reduce inflammation, decrease colonic pH, cholesterol, and CRP, and improve glucose homeostasis, blood lipid profiles, and body weight. And the most effective dietary patterns are those that minimize pathogenic dietary components and maximize protective dietary components. And protective factors, when you think about protective factors in foods, they are fiber, phytochemicals, plant enzymes that help to convert phytochemicals to their active forms, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds, plant sterols and stanols, pre and probiotics, and then of course macro and micronutrients that come with all of the above or come from healthy sources. And what kind of jumps off the page at you when you look at this list is these are compounds that are found either exclusively or predominantly in plant foods. And when you think of pathogenic factors, you think things like trans fatty acids, excessive saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, excessive sodium, new 5-GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule in meat, chemical contaminants, products of high temperature cooking. We'll talk about these later. Pro-oxidants, TMAO or trimethylamine N oxide, which is an atherogenic compound that's formed from carnitine or choline, mainly from meat again. Endotoxins are products of dead gram-negative bacteria in food and are highest in things like hamburger meat. You know, and I should go back there and say that these compounds, these pathogenic factors, are concentrated in the two categories of food that the World Health Organization warned us about: processed foods or highly processed foods and animal products. And the sad reality is that much of what consumers eat is a threat to health, or maybe even most of what consumers eat is a threat to health. Fortunately, we have a choice. And I want to just share one quick case study. I love this story because it's a story of a man by the name of Carlos. And he ended up going plant-based because his son was diagnosed with cancer. And his son was a very successful lawyer who had great attention to detail. And he was this is Andreas, by the way, and Andreas was probably one of the biggest foodies I've ever met. His life was about traveling the world, going to fancy restaurants, getting the best steak and the $500 bottle of wine. He and his wife flew to France to go into one of the 10 best restaurants in the world, paid $3,000 for one meal. So he was a foodie extraordinaire, and the last thing in the world he wanted to do was give up that lifestyle. But when he got diagnosed with cancer, he decided he needed to do the research and figure out what diet would best protect him. And he ended up going hardcore plant-based, 100%. I ended up becoming his dietitian, and Michael Clapper became his doctor, and we worked together, and within a year, his cancer was in remission. And the exciting thing about this story is that his whole family said, including his mom and dad and his wife and his brother and his brother's wife, said, whatever diet you're doing, we're doing with you, because we always want to be able to eat as a family. And I just thought that was just so beautiful. But Carlos, he had type 2 diabetes. He had been diagnosed in 1993. He had had a serious heart attack. He had hypertension, high cholesterol, peripheral artery disease. He was in early stage renal failure, and he had recurring gout probably 6, 7, 8 times a year. And his prognosis was not good. His endocrinologist said he had progressive irreversible diseases, and he probably wouldn't live much more than 2 to 3 years. He needed to get his affairs in order. His daily treatment was 17 pills and 35 to 40 units of insulin. After less than 1 year on a whole food plant-based diet, Carlos was taking 0 insulin and 0 pills. And here are his lab results. Fasting glucose, 80 to 87 milligrams per deciliter, A1C 5.1, blood pressure 115/70, and I should say that that was all without any medications. He had stopped all of his medications. His arteries opened up without surgery. His peripheral artery disease disappeared. His kidney function normalized, and he didn't have one single further recurrence of gout. And I have to tell you, he went to his doctor and he said, "Why didn't you tell me that this was possible? That all I had to do was change my diet and start exercising?" And his doctor responded, "I didn't tell you because I didn't know." He said, "As a matter of fact, I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it with my own two eyes." He said, "Now I know." So here's his coronary artery disease reports in 2005 and 2007. You can see in 2005, he had an inferior wall infarct with superimposed ischemia. He had inferior wall hypokinesis. He had a reduced ejection fraction of 50%. 2017, no evidence of abnormal cardiac activity, no evidence for reversible perfusion defects, no evidence of ischemia, normal chamber size, normal ejection fraction of 61%. And this is what is possible. And I know that not everyone is willing to make the necessary lifestyle changes, but I believe so strongly that everyone has a right to know that lifestyle changes are a safe and highly effective treatment option. And the bottom line is we know enough. We know enough to make lifestyle changes the first line of therapy for people with lifestyle-induced diseases. It's not rocket science. You know, and international and national health organizations are really starting to take note. This is from the World Health Organization 2021, World Health Organization Europe. Taken together, the beneficial effects of plant-based diets, including the protection they offer against premature mortality, provide strong evidence for public health guidelines recommending healthful plant-based diets as a means to prevent and control NCDs, or non-communicable diseases. So now we're on to the practical portion of the presentation, 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet. Step number 1, make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. This is not a diet of deprivation. This is a diet of beautiful colors and flavors and textures, and it is a diet that people, once they get into it, enjoy thoroughly. I don't think anyone in this room who's eating plant-based would say they love their diet less than they did before. I would say most of us would say we love our diet way more than we did before. You want to aim for at least 9 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. I would say I eat 12 to 14. And when I was at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetic annual conference, I had a test that analyzed your antioxidant status. And they said to me, "You have the highest antioxidant status of anyone we've ever tested." They said, "What do you eat?" And I was so happy to be able to say, "Well, I eat like 12 to 14 servings of fruits and vegetables. I'm vegan." And they said, "Oh, that explains it." They were trying to sell supplements. I said, "None needed." You want at least a couple of servings of legumes a day. And when I say legumes, we're talking beans and lentils and chickpeas and edamame and you know, all of those kinds of less processed legume foods, although tofu is a reasonable choice as well. Whole grains, you know, you can vary. You can get away with having none and just having starchy vegetables for your starch. If you're trying to lose weight, that can work well. But for most people who are trying to reverse disease, you're looking at probably 2 or 3 or 4 servings a day. Now, athletes might need 14 or 16 because they need a lot more calories. Nuts or seeds, I would say 1 or more servings a day, depending on your situation. They're very concentrated in calories, but they are also sources of healthy fats and omega-3 fatty acids. And so at the very least, you want to include some flaxseed or chia seed or something like that, as Dr. Esselstyn does on his cereal in the morning with a few walnuts. I shouldn't have said that. He would not like me to say it. It's true. And you want generous, you want to sprinkle it all with generous amounts of herbs and spices, because these are pretty potent sources of antioxidants and phytochemicals as well. And of course, these are the only foods with fiber. So, we know that fiber promotes regularity. Everybody knows that. But it also builds and maintains a healthy gut microbiome. It increases satiety, reduces cravings, reduces risk of colorectal cancer, helps to reduce cholesterol, stabilizes blood sugar, reduces risk of GI disorder, enhances immune function and hormonal imbalance, lessens hormonal imbalances. So fiber does a lot. And it was mentioned earlier today that 98% of the population doesn't get enough fiber. And it is so true. When we look at the RDA for fiber, it's 38 grams a day for men, 25 for women. And to be precise, it's 14 grams per 1,000 calories for anyone a year of age or older. So even for little kids, it's 14 grams per 1,000 calories. And so on average, it would be 38 for a man, 25 for a woman, but it could be different depending on your caloric needs. I would say optimal intakes are at least 40 to 60 grams a day. Actual intakes in the standard American diet are 15 to 17 grams a day. People eating whole food plant-based, it's probably closer to 40 to 80 grams a day that they're consuming. But the big shock is Paleolithic intakes ranged from 70 to 150 plus grams per day. So that people, historically consumed massive amounts of fiber. So this was one of the shockers. I remember when paleo diets got really popular, and that probably 10 or 12 years ago or 15 years ago, I can't remember, and all the fitness instructors at the gym were promoting paleo diets, and I thought I gotta get a handle on this, and I started to do research and just look at all of the evidence regarding true paleo diets and what they were consuming. Well, they were consuming like 500 or 600 milligrams of vitamin C. They were consuming 100 grams of fiber. They were, their diet was way closer to a vegan diet in terms of the macronutrient and micronutrient profile than anything that these guys that thought they were following a Paleolithic diet were doing. So it was really quite interesting. So I was able to come up with some good I guess arguments or criticisms of the paleo diet based on that research. And I even talked to the researchers who were considered the founding fathers of the paleo movement, and they were recommending that people get their protein from plants, which a lot of people don't realize. Step 2 is be very picky about your carbohydrates. This is where people who are switching over to a plant-based diet often fail. So this is important. Carbohydrates, contrary to popular opinion, are not the enemy. Carbohydrates from whole plant foods are consistently protective to human health. So there was a meta-analysis in 2018 that actually looked at carbohydrate intakes and mortality. And what they found was carbohydrate intakes at the very lowest end of the spectrum. So you're looking down here at sort of 20% of calories from carbohydrate or less, like a keto or paleo diet. Paleo is a little higher than keto. But their risk of mortality was 32% higher than people who were getting 50 to 55% of their calories from carbohydrates. They were sort of at the lowest risk. And then we saw 23% increased risk for people eating the most carbohydrates. However, the increased risk was only for those who were getting their carbohydrates from refined foods. So it was people who were eating the white rice and the white flour products and the sugar. That's where their carbohydrates were coming from. But there was another group, you can see below the line, the 50 to 55% line, where they actually had a lower incidence of mortality than the people in the 50 to 55% range. And those were people who were deriving their carbohydrates from whole plant foods. And then the one of the biggest cohorts in this study was the ERIC cohort. And the ERIC cohort was over 15,000 individuals, and they compared people. They adjusted for age and race and gender and all that stuff and compared people who were eating different levels of carbohydrate intakes to the reference range of 50 to 55% carbohydrate. People that were eating less than 30% of calories from carbohydrates increased the risk of mortality by 58%. Those at the 30 to 40% increased the risk by 32%. Those at 40 to 50% increased risk by 12%. Those that ate more, 55 to 65, there was no difference between those and the reference 50 to 55%. And those that were eating more than 65% increased 15%. But again, it's with people eating refined carbohydrates. And the results also varied with the macronutrient sources. So mortality increased 18% when carbohydrate was exchanged for animal-derived fat or protein. And mortality decreased by 18% when the substitutions were plant-based. So that tells you a lot. So why the downside of keto and other low-carb diets? Well, low-carb keto-type diets are low in fiber-rich plant foods, which can adversely affect the gut microbiome. They're low in phytochemicals, antioxidants, and other protective dietary components. They're often deficient in thiamine, folate, vitamins A, C, E, potassium, and magnesium. They're high in animal-derived fat and protein and the pathogenic compounds that are associated with these foods. And if we look at Blue Zone average carbohydrate intakes, they average 62% of their calories from carbohydrates. And if we look at the Semene from Bolivia, South America, these are the folks with the lowest rates of coronary artery disease of any population on the planet. And they average 72% of calories from carbohydrates. You see, this is what the carbohydrate naysayers, the keto folks, forget. And that is that almost all plant foods are the main macronutrient is carbohydrate. So if you look at fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, and even non-starchy vegetables, carbohydrates range from 58 to 92% of calories. These are the healthiest foods. These are the foods with the phytochemicals and antioxidants and fiber and all the things we need to be getting. And they are predominantly carbohydrate food. The only exception is nuts and seeds at about 12% because they're predominantly fat. On the other hand, refined carbohydrates are bad news. So what are refined carbohydrates? Well, they're high carbohydrate foods that have been stripped of everything that is of value to human health before we eat them. So, by various food processing techniques. So we're talking about refined sugars like table sugar and syrups and jams and jellies and sweet beverages, and refined starches like white flour products, white rice products, and the like. So that's refined carbohydrates. The problem is that most of the carbohydrates people eat, especially in the United States and Canada and other developed nations, are refined. And therein lies the problem. Refined carbohydrates increase the risk of overeating and obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, high triglycerides, and heart disease. And there was a study that was quite stunning and just came out, 2023, on sugar and health. And it was an umbrella review that included over 8,600 articles, 73 meta-analyses. And they found that added sugars had a significant harmful association with 18 endocrine or metabolic outcomes, 10 cardiovascular outcomes, 7 cancer outcomes, and 10 other outcomes, including, of course, dental and neuropsychiatric and hepatic and osteal and, all of those kinds of things. And the authors actually recommended that we reduce free sugars or added sugars to below 25 grams a day. That's approximately 6 teaspoons. And you'd think, 6 teaspoons? That's a lot of sugar. You'll be surprised. And they recommended that people limit sugar-sweetened beverages to less than 1 serving a week, and a serving was defined as 7 to 12 ounces. And the international and national recommendations for added sugars are not that far from them. The World Health Organization suggests not more than 10% or 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet, but they add for additional health benefits, people really should be striving for 5% or 6 teaspoons of sugar a day at most. U.S. dietary guidelines are still at 10% of calories. The American Heart Association has stricter guidelines of no more than 6% of calories, about 9 teaspoons for a man, 6 teaspoons for a woman, and they also recommend no added sugars at all for children under the age of 2 years. Average intakes are 17 teaspoons a day in the United States for adults. It's higher for adolescents. So how much sugar are we getting in foods? Well, you remember the 12 teaspoon is sort of your absolute upper limit. Well, you get that from one serving of soda or flavored coffee or a fruit yogurt, a cup of fruit yogurt, or a big pastry like a cinnamon bun. You'll be there and you've eaten nothing else. You'll even get close to the 6 teaspoons by eating things that you wouldn't even think of as being sugar sources, like an energy bar, or a quarter cup of barbecue sauce gives you 4, a pack of instant oatmeal, and most people will eat 2 packs, so you'd be at 7. And what you need to know when you look at food labels is they always tell you the grams of sugar in a serving of food. Well, about 4 grams is equal to a teaspoon. So you can calculate the number of teaspoons of sugar by looking at the number of grams and knowing that there's 4 grams per teaspoon. Now, if you look at where sugar is coming from in the U.S. diet, almost half of the sugar that people eat in the United States comes from sweet beverages. If people did nothing else other than remove liquid sugar from their diets, they'd be consuming half the sugar that they are. About a third comes from sweets and snacks. So cut those 2 things out. And it's a pretty similar story for refined starches. So if you take a grain, like, whether it's wheat or spelt or kamut or whatever it is, and you refine it into white flour, you're removing 2 of the 3 parts of the grain. So grain has an outer layer, which is called the bran, and that's the fiber-rich, fairly mineral-rich outer layer. Then it has something called the germ inside, and the germ is like the storehouse of nutrients for the kernel of wheat. That's where most of the phytochemicals are. That's where a lot of the nutrients, the vitamin E and so forth. And then what you're left with is endosperm when you make white flour. So it's mainly carbohydrate. There's a little bit of protein and a few nutrients, but in the process of turning wheat into white flour, you lose 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and 95% of the protective phytochemicals. And then, of course, who eats a bowl of white flour? Nobody eats a bowl of white flour. Before you eat the flour, add fat and sugar and salt and food additives, and then you eat the white flour. And therein lies the problem. Not only have you removed almost everything of value to human health before you eat the stuff, you add a bunch of components that we know are pathogenic, are very harmful to health, and then you eat the white flour. So it's like a double whammy. On the other hand, whole grains are healthy foods. There was a 2016 meta-analysis of 45 studies that found per 90-gram or 3-ounce serving of whole grains, and this is, like usually you think of an ounce as a serving for bread, but it reduced all-cause mortality, 17%, cardiovascular disease, 22%, diabetes, 51%, total cancer, 15%, and respiratory disease, 22%. So just, having 3 ounces of whole grains a day. But one thing this is a thing that I think in the plant-based communities sometimes we fail with. All whole grains, people think, oh, it's whole grain, I'll purchase those cookies, they've got whole grains. But all whole grains are not created equal. So a granola bar doesn't equal a bowl of oatmeal, and a box of flaked kamut cereal does not equal a bowl of kamut berry salad. There is a hierarchy of whole grains, and at the top of the hierarchy are intact whole grains. Nothing added, nothing taken away. They are as they are grown in nature. And probably the healthiest way to eat them would be sprouted or cooked. That would be fine. And then you've got broken whole grains, and then rolled, and then shredded, and then ground, and then flaked, and then puffed. And remember, this does not include any refined grains. This is just whole grains. You can process whole grains without losing the germ or the bran. You can process them into various foods. And the more you process them, the higher the glycemic impact, because the greater the surface area. You're increasing the surface area of the food and the rate at which it will be absorbed into the bloodstream. When you subject foods to heat and light and oxygen and pressure, you destroy nutrients as well. So as you go down the list, these whole grains become less and less desirable. If you're trying to reverse chronic disease, you want to stay near the top of the whole grain hierarchy. And when I have someone who has diabetes and it's stubborn, we say, only intact whole grains. Don't consume anything else. Just eat intact whole grains. I mean, a few broken whole grains, a few rolled whole grains may be okay, but you want to really focus on the intact whole grains as opposed to the flour products or the puffed or the flaked grains. So carbohydrate common sense, you want to get your carbohydrates from high fiber whole plant foods. You want to avoid added sugars, especially in beverages, and you want to minimize all refined carbohydrates, both starches and sugars. Step number 3, pick plant protein sources instead of meat. And the reason is very simple. All of those things that we talked about were so beneficial, in foods, things like the fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants are either high or very high in plant protein foods like legumes, and they're all either zero or very low in meat. All of the things that are pathogenic, like the saturated fat and trans fats and new 5-GC and all of those things, are either low or zero in legumes, and they are essentially moderate to high in meat. So it's really pretty simple to understand. Legumes are associated with lower mortality. There was a 2023 meta-analysis of 32 cohorts over a million participants that reported a 6% drop in mortality for every quarter cup serving of legumes. So if you're eating a whole cup, you're reducing mortality 24%. And then there was another study of people 70 plus that reported a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality for every 20 grams, 2 tablespoons consumed. So in this study, eating a half a cup would reduce your risk by 28 to 32%. So this is pretty shocking numbers. We see the exact opposite for meat. And people say, oh, not for unprocessed meat. Unprocessed meat is fine. That's absolutely not true. If you look at all of the studies that we have, and these are some of the key studies, you can see, actually you can't see the difference in the colors that well on this wall, but the very light red, or the pink, is processed meat. And you see the biggest increases, somewhere between about 13 and 44% increase in mortality. And for unprocessed meat, it's about 5 to 18% increase in mortality. Consistently. This is not a one-off. And then we actually had a few studies that really quantified the impact of various animal products. And so this particular study from 2016, Dr. Song, they followed over 130,000 individuals for about 3 decades. And they found that replacing 3% of calories from animal products with plant protein would reduce risk of mortality. Just to put this in perspective, 3% of calories from a 2,000 calorie diet is 60 calories. That's less than 1 egg. That's 1 ounce of meat. Okay? So doing that, if you replace processed meat with plant protein, you reduce risk of death by 34% for 1 ounce. So double that for 2 ounces of processed meat, you're looking at 68%. So for eggs, it was 19%. For unprocessed meat, it was 12%. For dairy, 8%. For poultry or fish, 6%. Just 3% of calories. And then we got another study from Japan. This is 2019, over 70,000 individuals for about 2 decades. And the numbers were even more shocking. So total mortality, if you replace red meat with, and 3% of calories, same thing, with plant protein, you replace total mortality by 34% if it's red meat and by 46% if it's processed meat. And for cancer mortality, 42% for red meat and 50% for processed meat. Unbelievable. And then the last study that did this sort of 3% thing came out in 2020, over 400,000 individuals. This is the National Institutes of Health, AARP, Diet and Health Study. And they found replacing 3% of animal protein with plant protein reduced overall mortality 10%. And if what you're replacing was eggs, it was 24% for men, 21% for women. For red meat, 13% for men, 15% for women. Dairy, 8% for both men and women. And white meat, it was 2% for men and 5% for women. And then another study that actually looked at high protein intakes and mortality. This was a study of over 6,000 individuals followed for 18 years. They found people with intakes of over 20% of calories from protein had an increase in mortality of 74%, cancer mortality 433%, or that's 4.3 times, diabetes risk 393%, or almost 4 times. But, this is the important but, associations were abolished or greatly attenuated when the protein came from plants. So we only saw these increases if the protein came from animal foods. And a paleo diet is about 30% of calories from protein. So it's not good news. Step number 4 is to replace harmful fat with healthy fat. So you want to make whole plant foods the primary sources of fat. And the reason is high-fat whole plant foods are high in fiber and antioxidants and sterols and stanols and phytochemicals, rather than concentrated fats and oils, which provide a lot of calories and very few nutrients. These foods, the concentrated fats and oils, contain about 120 calories per tablespoon, but very few nutrients. So they have the lowest nutrient density of any food that you might include in the diet. And so, for someone who's an athlete who needs to eat 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day, they might find it helpful to be able to put a little bit of oil on something to increase the caloric value of the diet. But for people that are trying to reverse disease, you want every calorie that crosses your lips to be doing something good for you. You want as much nutrient density as you can possibly get. And so that's, every single cell of your body is a product of what you put in your mouth. And so you really need to be fine-tuning your choices in those situations. We need to cut back on saturated fat. The American Heart Association says less than 5 to 6% of calories for heart disease risk reduction. So for people eating 2,000 calories a day, that'd be 16 grams. For people who are trying to lose weight and eating, say, 15 or 1,600 calories, it would be 12 or 13 grams. And if you look at the amount of saturated fat in food, a couple slices of Meat Lover's Pizza, you're over the top at 22 grams. A double cheeseburger, 18 grams. A soft taco with beef and cheese, 16 grams. If you had a cup of whole milk and 2 ounces of cheese, you're over the top as well. Compare that to high-fat plant foods. You're getting between about 0.5 gram and 2 grams, even from, a good-sized serving like a half of an avocado or an ounce of nuts or seeds. They're much lower in saturated fat. The only real exception in the plant world is tropical oils, which are very high in saturated fat. So an ounce of coconut would have about 7 grams of saturated fat. Now, you also want to minimize exposure to damaged fats. These are fats that get oxidized from food preparation. You want to avoid fried and highly processed foods. You want to minimize oils in cooking if they're used at all. And if you do use them, you never want an oil to smoke. When an oil smokes, you're producing products of oxidation that are very damaging to human health. You want to store high-fat foods carefully. So all my shelled nuts and seeds are stored in the refrigerator or freezer because you want to protect those fats from going rancid. You want to optimize your intake of omega-3s. So if you're a plant-based eater, you're looking at about 2 to 4 grams of alpha-linolenic acid a day, and including direct sources possibly of EPA and DHA, depending on your your situation. So how much ALA or the plant omega-3 do you get in foods? Well, you get about 2.6 grams in an ounce of walnuts. You get 1.8 in a tablespoon of chia, a tablespoon of ground flax, about 1.6, 1 in a tablespoon of hemp seeds. And leafy greens are about half the fat is omega-3, but you'd have to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough. You'd need about 20 to 40 cups a day. And there are all of these microalgae supplements, which I mentioned earlier. And people, are inefficient at converting ALA into EPA and DHA, and conversion is lower in those with hypertension and diabetes, and it decreases as we age as well. So for some people, obtaining EPA and DHA directly from microalgae, is a very, very reasonable option. And I would say for most people, you're looking at 200 or 300 milligrams a day. Some people need more to get their omega-3 index up. But I've seen people needing as much as 800 or 1,000 if they're really low. Step number 5 is to maximize phytochemicals and antioxidants. So you want to think variety here. The greater the variety of plant foods you eat, the greater the variety of phytochemicals and antioxidants. A single orange has over 170 different phytochemicals. It's phenomenal. You get a lot from different foods, but the greater the variety, the greater the variety of those protective compounds. You want to think color. So the richest sources are often the most colorful. You might want to choose purple instead of white onions, black or red instead of brown rice, dark instead of light greens, for example. So really think color as you're making your food selections. Try to eat the entire rainbow. One of the things that I do is when I make a big giant salad is I try to get something from every color of the rainbow in that salad. You want to go for about 3 green, 2 orange yellow, 2 pink red, at least 1 purple blue, and 1 white beige every single day if you can. And you want to eat more raw foods, and the reason is because raw foods contain enzymes that help us to convert certain phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolites or their active forms, like myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables converts glucosinolates into isothiocyanates, and the alanase in allium vegetables like garlic and onions converts allan to the active form allicin. And start sprouting. When you sprout a little plant, phytochemicals are there to protect the plant. So guess what happens? These little babies need a lot of protection. So the phytochemical army just multiplies. It multiplies 5 to 50 times in these foods. So including some sprouts can be helpful. You want to pile on the herbs and spices because gram for gram, they probably have more phytochemicals than any other foods. And drink antioxidant-rich teas like green tea and hibiscus teas and ginger and turmeric teas and matcha and, chamomile and all of that. Step number 6, minimize dietary contaminants. And this one can be a challenge for people because contaminants are plentiful in the food supply. And here the worst offenders are environmental contaminants, the byproducts of high temperature cooking, and food additives. So environmental contaminants, we're talking about pesticides in conventional produce. We're talking about heavy metals like mercury in fish and seafood, arsenic in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed. And we're talking about persistent organic pollutants like PCBs, DDT, and dioxins, which are notorious for moving up the food chain. So, of course, they're highest in animal products like fish, meat, and dairy products. The solutions here are to choose organic when you can. And a lot of people like myself, I can't afford to buy everything organic. But at least be aware of the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. And the Clean 15 are the foods, the conventional foods that have the lowest amounts of pesticides. And so if you can, only afford to buy some things organic, you might want to go for the Dirty Dozen. Those are the things with the greatest amount of pesticides in the conventional aisle. And so that's, and they put out a new list every year. So you can go to the environmental working group and get the new list. You want to eat lower on the food chain, and you want to vary your grains if grains are part of your diet. inorganic arsenic is associated with cancer and increased risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And rice can be a really rich source of arsenic. So if you eat a variety of grains and not, rice all the time, that's one way of doing it. You can carefully select rice. Rice from California seems to be a little safer in terms of arsenic content than rice from some of the other parts of the United States. And the other thing you can do is cook it like you cook pasta. So you cook it in 6 to 10 times more water than rice, and you get rid of about 80% of the arsenic by doing that. You just drain it, and it works out perfectly fine. The products of high temperature cooking, we're talking about things like heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrylamide, and advanced glycation end products, and we talked a little bit about these already, so I'll go through them quickly. Heterocyclic amines are formed from animal products like meat and eggs, because a food has to have creatine or creatinine to form these HCAs. And so you're looking mainly at grilled and fried meats as being the key sources of heterocyclic amines, and they're carcinogens. And then there's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are formed in anything that blackens. Even dark brown things, but blackened foods are really rich sources of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're also mutagens and carcinogens. And then acrylamide is mainly in potato products, because you have to have asparagine to form acrylamide, and potatoes are really rich in the amino acid asparagine. And it doesn't matter if it's white potatoes or sweet potatoes. Potatoes are high in asparagine, from both categories. And so sweet potato chips are just as high in acrylamide as regular potato chips. And then people wonder about air frying if you're producing acrylamide, and yes, you are, but not nearly as much as oil frying. So it's definitely safer, and it's a treat, but you probably don't want to be air frying everything all the time. Just recognize that you do produce some products of oxidation. And then advanced glycation end products, which are strongly associated with some of the complications of diabetes and other diseases as well, and even cognitive decline and so forth. They are most concentrated in processed meats that are fried and, or cooked with dry heat. So these are, again, they're the advanced glycation end products are really the irreversible products of the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is the browning of foods, but they are most concentrated. Bacon is at the very top of the list. Solutions here. You want to just avoid charred or blackened foods as much as possible, especially meat, poultry, and fish. Avoid deep fried foods, and use moist cooking methods more often than dry cooking methods. So steaming and stewing and boiling and water sauteing, they produce far fewer products of oxidation. And then we want to really cut back on food additives, and they're mainly in highly processed foods. They add, color and flavor and shelf life and all of that. They're not all harmful, but it's best to limit food additives, and in some cases, it's probably a good idea to steer clear. And we talked about some of these already. Artificial colors, we've banned like red dye number 3, but we haven't banned, or red dye number 5 and 6. I can't remember. I think 3 and 40 still haven't been banned, but they need to be, because they can increase risk of cancer. Artificial sweeteners can harm, some of them can harm the gut microbiome. And these diacetyl containing flavorings in butter flavored popcorn can damage your lungs. Phosphate containing additives can increase the impacts on cardiovascular disease and kidney function. Sodium nitrate in all of these processed meats can increase risk of some cancers. They get converted to nitrosamines. And so these are just things that you want to minimize in your diet. And the solution is really simple. Eat whole foods, avoid highly processed foods. So finally, step 7 is to meet your needs for all nutrients. You can do all of these things right, but I'll tell you right now, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you don't ensure you've got a source of B12 in your diet, because your homocysteine will shoot up, you'll get all symptoms of B12 deficiency. You have to have B12. And so you need to get educated about the nutrients that could fall short. And generally, in a plant-based diet, plant eaters eat way more folate and vitamin C and K and E and iron and potassium and magnesium and copper. Iron, although even though we eat more iron in a vegan diet, we tend to absorb it less efficiently, so we still need to be aware of iron. But nutrients that most commonly fall short are vitamins B12, calcium if you're not consuming good sources of calcium, or fortified foods like the non-dairy milks with calcium, vitamin D, iodine, zinc, choline may be an issue, and omega-3 fatty acids. So you want to ensure reliable sources of these nutrients. And one of the things when I became a plant-based dietitian, the books that I wrote, that's what it was all about, was to help people make sure that they wouldn't fall short, because a failed vegan is exhibit number one for why people are justified eating meat. So, you want to do well. You want to be an example of health to everyone around you. Because for a lot of people, you're the only vegan they've ever met. You do bad, and they just say, oh yeah, that doesn't work. So plant-based diets, we have lots of food guides. This is the food guide in Nourish. But we've developed a number of plant-based food guides that are pretty widely used now, and that can help. I wanted to point out Canada's food guide in 2019, huge change. And we did put some pressure on the government to really, one thing that they promised that they would do is not allow industry influence in that food guide. And they succeeded at that. They did not. And so the food guide no longer has a designated dairy group. So you can see half the plate is fruits and vegetables, a quarter of the plate whole grains, and a quarter of the plate is protein foods. But they very strongly encourage people to eat mostly plant protein foods rather than animal protein foods. And they say make water the drink of choice. So this guide works for people eating all dietary patterns, which is quite wonderful. So the whole message for my presentation is every time you eat or drink, you either feed disease or you fight disease. And well-designed whole food plant-based diets provide a powerful means of fighting disease. And the good news is that the power of plant-based diets extends far beyond ourselves. Plant-based diets are ecologically sustainable. There was a study recently done, it was 2023 study, that compared popular diets and their carbon footprints. At the top of the chart are keto diets at 2.1 kilograms CO2 equivalents per 1,000 calories. And if you go down, then you have paleo, omnivore, pescatarian, vegetarian, and vegan at 0.69. On average, keto diets produce 4.2 times greater greenhouse or greater carbon footprint than vegan diets. And the reason is really simple. The carbon footprint of food is high for animal products, and it's low for plant foods. So when people, walk over or move in the direction of plant-based eating, they reduce their carbon footprint very, very significantly. And of course, a plant-based diet is a very ethically justifiable diet. When you look at over 70 billion animals are slaughtered for food in the world every year, and over 90% are raised in CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. And it's just interesting to learn a little bit more about this. In my view, it just doesn't make any sense to cause so much pain, suffering, and death in other living beings when it's not only unnecessary, but it actually undermines the life support systems of this planet. By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. And we have a choice. When we consider the consequences of our food choices, both for ourselves and beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet really becomes both an ecological and an ethical imperative. And I'd like to conclude my presentation with the rest of the story about my dad. Because it wasn't 2 years after our interaction that my dad had a stroke at work and was taken to the hospital. He hadn't seen a doctor in over 25 years. His blood pressure was 240 over 120, and his blood sugar was over 500 milligrams per deciliter. He was a 2-pack-a-day smoker, and the doctor said to him, we need to put grafts from below your heart into both your legs, And we're not going to do it unless you stop smoking, because if you don't stop smoking, you'll be dead within 6 months. And my dad said, well, what if I do? He said, you might have 3 years. My dad was 49 years old. And I'll never forget sitting on my dad's hospital bed with him, and we were both in tears. And my dad said to me, what was I thinking? He said, I don't want to die. He said, I want to dance with my sweetheart at our 50th wedding anniversary. He said, I want to see my grandchildren grow up. And I think it was at that point that my dad really got that there is no freedom when you have no health. And he really got that life was a lot more precious than potato chips. And my dad didn't make the changes Carlos made, but he did make some pretty big changes. He went from eating bacon and eggs to eating oatmeal and ground flaxseed and blueberries, and he lived another, I think, 26 years, which shocked his doctors to all get out. They couldn't believe that. I mean, he had lots of health problems, and he was diabetic, and he wasn't willing to go all the way. But I'm so grateful for the extra years that we had with him. And he did dance with his sweetheart at their 50th wedding anniversary. So that I'm very, very grateful for. And those are some of my books, which I'd be very happy to sign. And I will conclude at that. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Brenda.